Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, about a month ago, our family took a trip to Montreal, and we knew it would be an opportunity to experience a little different culture without going too far, but we weren't really sure what to expect other than the fact that they were French speakers. And our flight arrived in the evening. We took a cab from the airport to the place we were staying, and as we got closer, we started passing a number of parks, some of them large, some of them smaller, but it was just an hour or so before sunset, and we were really struck by something. There were lots of people just gathered in these parks in small groups, and they were picnicking or chatting. It wasn't just one park. And there was a mix of ethnicities, and I commented on this to our cab driver who spoke only broken English, and he said, "Oh yes, this happens a lot." He said there was a holiday coming up, but that it was typical, and it was our first introduction to just a different culture. Most of the time when I think of parks and outdoor areas that I'm familiar with in the US, people go there for a purpose. To play on the basketball or tennis courts, or to use the play equipment for kids. There may be some chatting among parents or friends, but as soon as the organized activity is done, people generally leave. People go for walks or runs on trails and sidewalks, but what we were seeing felt somehow different. There was no structure or activity that we could see. It was just community, people spending time with people. And in the week we spent there, we saw that continue. During the pandemic, Montreal started designating specific avenues and roads around the city as pedestrian only. And we didn't know it when we booked our stay, but we were located right off one of these main roads in a more residential area of the city. And on the corner was the local boulangerie for our morning croissant. And this road extended for about 35 blocks of pedestrian-only walking and shopping and just community life. We saw locals running into each other and just sitting down to chat on the spur of the moment on these beautiful kind of artistic benches. Montreal is very international and global in its makeup, and there was just a melding of people that felt very alive and peaceful. And in our short visit, we had a distinct sense for how the city put people from all different walks of life together naturally in the course of their days on mass transit, in parks, and walking on streets. And we felt different and more part of something while we were there. No place is perfect, obviously. And I like a lot of things about where we live, but I came back with more perspective on how our own society functions. We're more spread out and dependent on cars. We pop in and out of homes and stores from our cars. We don't spend as much time together unless it's intentional. Churches remain a place to come together. They foster community. And in fact, this year, the Pew Research Center reported that Americans without a religious affiliation are less likely to volunteer, less likely to feel satisfied with their community and social life, and more likely to say they feel lonely. Sociologist Eric Kleinberg doesn't blame individuals for this, but notes that Americans as a whole have fewer shared spaces where connections are formed due to changes in our society. We're continuing our series today, Change Your World. There's a lot happening in our world that can fill us with worry and frustration, and sometimes we feel like maybe throwing up our arms a little bit. But we're reflecting on that axiom from St. Francis de Sales, bloom where you're planted. How do we participate in reclaiming hope and joy for ourselves and those around us? Today we're talking about bridging divides, and part of that is the simple act of actually being together. Over the next several weeks, we're going to be focusing on readings from the letter to the Ephesians. And Ephesians was written as an encouragement for how to live together in community. Many have attributed the letter to Paul, and there's evidence to suggest it may have been another apostle. Ephesians seems to have been written primarily to Gentile Christians. Jewish Christianity was the earliest form of Christian community. Jesus and his disciples were Jewish. Jesus reached out to Gentiles during his own ministry, but it was through the work of Paul and the apostles that the message of Jesus began to spread widely to those who would have been seen as foreigners previously. And this became an early point of friction in the Christian community. How do you resolve the different customs and cultural differences? Jesus, in his own ministry, broke down those barriers, but some in the early church tried to rebuild them. The author of Ephesians speaks into this divide. For he, Jesus, is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross, thus putting to death that hostility through it. The author has the divide between these two historical Christian groups in mind, which really represent a multitude of different ethnicities and nationalities. And I think there's a lot for us here to learn that can be applied to the divisions that show up in our own modern world, whether it relates to religion more specifically or whatever it is that divides us. Historically speaking, our American society is still pretty young. We're still trying to figure out how we resolve distinctions between people within a democracy. Do you ever notice that at times people just want to lay down the hammer and end the conversation? The general sentiment is something like, enough, I can't make sense of this, someone needs to lay down the law and say what's right, and that happens to be me. Very often people do still form their sense of identity and belonging around biology, religion, race, and ethnicity. And what the author of Ephesians is saying here is that Jesus is removing these as sources of division. They no longer are central to our identity as God's people, but Jesus is what binds us together. But it goes further than that. Again, it says, he has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace. You know, I've tried to spend more time in the last week listening to people with a different perspective than me when it comes to Christian faith. I believe that the central aspect of Christian faith is what Jesus said it was: loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And yet I hear a lot of people talk about faith as a set of laws and rules. When we look back at the legacy of Jesus, we can focus on his teachings and words. We can look at his life, and then we can look at his death and resurrection. For many historic Christians, Jesus' death and resurrection actually surpasses his words and life. The Passion story and the Easter story are really the defining events of Jesus' life and say the most about who Jesus is and what it means for us. But of course, we do still pay a lot of attention to his words and his life. The whole Bible, including the Old Testament, helps us see and understand our human relationship with God throughout the ages. And there's a lot to learn from that as well. But we know that some of those earlier stories are given new meaning and understanding in the eyes of Jesus, are read in new ways now for us as Christians. Jesus took Old Testament laws regarding Sabbath, for example, and redefined them in terms more of as a gift to us and our neighbor. Peter famously received a vision in the book of Acts that led him to put aside all of the Old Testament laws and dietary restrictions that are central to Jewish faith. And as I said, what I hear from a lot of people who identify as Christians is a focus on law. The idea that both Old Testament and New Testament biblical laws and behavior is what's fundamental about faith. If you're sinful and do certain things wrong, then you are outside of God's salvation and love, and you deserve judgment or exclusion. And the desire is to enforce those laws on society as a whole, even. Can you find verses that sound judgmental and definitive in the Bible? Of course. But as a pastor, I find that broader approach very troubling. Not only does it distort the overall unmistakable message of the gospel and what Jesus himself says about love, but oftentimes it seeks to impose these laws on those who are not Christian. For those who seek to preserve what they see as their faith and culture by doing this, actually undermine it all. We can certainly talk about the value and wisdom of those teachings and laws, and there is a place for both law and gospel and Christian teaching more broadly, and I've done some pretty in-depth preaching and teaching on that very point in the past, and will again. If you're interested in that, I can point you to some past messages. There should be civic laws that govern us and that we follow, but I personally do not accept a version of faith that focuses on stringent enforcement of spiritual laws in a public setting in a way that overwhelms the loving spirit of who Jesus was. What I'm suggesting is not some modern spin on Christian faith. This was, in fact, at the heart of the Lutheran Reformation 500 years ago, but you can see that elsewhere. And there's a lot we can learn from one another across Christian traditions, but this reflexive caution about allowing law to overtake love remains a distinct contribution of our Lutheran theological tradition. The trouble with a law-based definition of faith, apart from the fact that it doesn't faithfully represent who Jesus was, is that we tend to pick and choose the behaviors that we judge. Rather than ground our identity as Christians and people of faith in biblical law, Jesus himself invites us to ground our identity in knowing that all of us have been forgiven, that by his death and resurrection we are set free and made children of God. We are set free to love others. As Christians, that is our common ground, or it should be. And it means that we see everyone as loved by God, even those who are not Christian. It's not finally for us to judge one another based on one set of rituals being more acceptable to God than another, as it was between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in those early years. It's not about one distinction based on ethnicity or biology being better than another. What defines us is how we do what Jesus did: love. And that's harder than it sounds. It's a lifelong challenge and journey. As Ephesians says, he came and proclaimed peace to you who were far off and peace to those who were near. In other words, to everyone. When we look out across our modern landscape, there appear to be a lot of divides. Some of them seem insurmountable. Jesus repeatedly walked right past them in his time. He engaged people who were considered foreigners and adversaries to his people. He showed them dignity and respect, and yes, he would sometimes challenge them too. But he often reserved his hardest words for those who used biblical law and harsh distinctions to place themselves over others. We have an opportunity to shape our communities and our church in a way that brings people together and allows the life Jesus intended to flourish, not just for ourselves, but for all of our neighbors. We can live in our own culture and reality long enough that we don't see how it gets in the way of doing that at times, or how new cultural patterns could help us live into it more fully. We may worry how changes happening around us will turn out, but if we continue to be the ones who share God's love and be the light that we're called to share at our baptisms, then we can positively shape the world around us, at least on our good days. And the rest, we leave up to God to guide us in His grace and to bring all people into His love and care. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.